You wake up in the morning and decide to drink coffee instead of tea. Bravo. Free will in action, right? Or was that just the sum total of your habits, your sleep cycle, your culture, your genetics, and that one YouTube ad you watched last week about productivity hacks? We live in a world that worships choice. From the toothpaste aisle to presidential elections, we're told that freedom is sacred and that we are the authors of our own lives. But what if that story is fiction? This video asks the uncomfortable question, do we really choose anything at all? From philosophers like Schopenhauer, who claimed we can do what we will, but not will what we will, to neuroscientists like Sam Harris, who argue free will is an illusion, and Daniel Dennett, who offers a more optimistic twist. We're diving headfirst into the paradox of personal freedom. Are we independent agents, or just biological algorithms reacting to circumstances we never chose in the first place? Buckle up. Your sense of agency is about to get politely dismantled. Schopenhauer's will, the unconscious force that owns you. Arthur Schopenhauer didn't believe in freedom. Not the comforting, motivational kind you put on vision boards. Not the kind you print on t-shirts or shout during revolutions. For him, free will was a beautiful illusion, one we cling to because the alternative feels unbearable. His view? You are not the master of your choices. You are the puppet of your desires. And your desires? They don't ask your permission. They just move you. According to Schopenhauer, what really drives you is something he calls the will, not in the rational, conscious sense, but in a primal, blind, unconscious way. Think of it as life's raw engine. It doesn't think. It wants. It pushes. It aches. It doesn't care about logic, morality, or your 5-year plan. It just urges. Hunger, fear, lust, ambition, boredom, these aren't just feelings. They're expressions of the will, using you as a vehicle. You think you made a decision. What actually happened is the will acted, and your intellect showed up later to narrate it with a nice little story that makes it sound like you were in charge. Ever wonder why you do things you know are bad for you? Why you say yes when you want to say no? Why you sabotage something just as it's going well? That's the will. It's not evil. It's just indifferent. It wants what it wants, and you, dear rational creature, are often just along for the ride. Schopenhauer doesn't sugarcoat it. Your conscious mind isn't the CEO. It's more like a PR department, constantly spinning decisions it didn't make to preserve your sense of agency. So what does this mean for freedom? In Schopenhauer's world, freedom doesn't mean I do whatever I want. It means I do what I'm compelled to want. You're free to follow your will, but not to choose what it wills. It's like being chained to a wild horse and calling yourself a rider because you're technically upright. And if that sounds bleak, that's because, well, it is. Schopenhauer wasn't in the business of comfort. He believed that the sooner you accept this lack of freedom, the more clearly you see the absurd mechanics of your life, and maybe, just maybe, stop identifying so hard with the chaos. But there's something strangely liberating in his pessimism. If you didn't choose your desires, maybe you don't have to blame yourself for them either. Maybe your deepest flaws aren't moral failings, but expressions of a force you never summoned. Maybe guilt is the wrong response, and curiosity is the better one. Maybe the question isn't, why did I choose this, but what part of me needed this, and why? Schopenhauer's genius was in flipping the script. Instead of asking how free you are, he asked, what is freedom really when you're moved by instincts that don't consult you first? And his answer? True freedom isn't about control. It's about seeing the lack of it, and choosing, with humility, not to mistake the noise for your voice. In the end, Schopenhauer invites you to look behind the curtain, to stop pretending your choices are pristine little snowflakes falling from the sky of reason. They're not. They're shaped by hunger, history, hormones, by forces that don't care about your image or intentions. But if you can see that clearly without panic, then you've already taken the first step out of the illusion. And that, ironically, is a kind of freedom, just not the one you were sold. Sam Harris and the neuroscience of no choice. If Schopenhauer cracked the illusion of free will with philosophy, Sam Harris brought a neuroscience hammer and smashed it to pieces. According to Harris, not only do we lack control over our desires, we don't even control our thoughts. They just appear, spontaneously, without warning, without permission. One moment you're brushing your teeth, and the next you're replaying a 7-year-old argument in your head. Did you choose that thought? No. It chose you. Sam Harris argues that free will is not just an illusion, it's a dangerous one. We believe we're autonomous, rational agents making deliberate decisions, but brain scans tell a different story. In some experiments, neuroscientists can predict your decision up to 7 seconds before you become aware of making it. 7 seconds. That's the eternity of neuroscience. Your brain lights up with intent long before you arrive on the scene to declare, "I've decided." In other words, the mind is more like a stage than a director. You're not calling the shots, you're narrating them after they've already happened. For Harris, the implications are profound and a little brutal. If we don't control our thoughts, preferences, or impulses, how can we be truly responsible for anything? Not in the legal sense, but in the existential one. How can you take credit for success or blame for failure if the very machinery driving your life was built by genes, upbringing, and random circumstance? This isn't a philosophical detour. Harris believes this insight matters deeply, because if we truly grasp the absence of free will, we stop clinging to the fiction of moral superiority. We stop vilifying people for being bad and start asking more useful questions, like what made them this way? What conditions produced this behavior? What trauma, what wiring, what lack of options? Compassion doesn't excuse harm. It just gets smarter about it. And when you realize that you didn't choose your kindness or discipline any more than someone else chose their addiction or rage, you can let go of pride and judgment in equal measure. But this view is hard to live with, because our entire society is built on the idea of individual agency. Politics, law, religion, relationships, they all rely on the assumption that we're choosing our actions freely. If we're not, then what's left? Are we just puppets wired with complex algorithms? Meat machines running outdated software? Harris would say, yes, in a way, but that doesn't have to be depressing. In fact, he sees freedom not in control, but in clarity. If you know that you're not the author of your thoughts, then you're less likely to get hijacked by them. You stop confusing the voice in your head with the truth. You create space between reaction and response. And that space, that's where mindfulness lives. That's where peace begins. Because here's the quiet irony. The more you accept that you're not in control, the more room you create to observe what's really going on. Not to change the script, but to stop identifying so completely with it. You're still a character in the play. You just realize you're not the playwright. Sam Harris's view challenges everything we're taught about effort, merit, and morality. But it also opens the door to something radical. A life without the heavy burden of being in charge. A life where you don't have to fix every thought, control every mood, or justify every mistake as if you were its mastermind. You weren't. You're just here, watching it unfold. And sometimes that quiet watching is more powerful than all the willpower in the world. So next time you catch yourself thinking, I should have known better, pause, ask, was that really my choice? Or just another wave in the ocean of my brain? And if it was a wave, then maybe the work isn't to fight it, but to learn how to surf. Dennett's compatibilism, a softer cage but still a cage. At this point you might be feeling a little crushed. Schopenhauer tells you you're driven by blind will. Sam Harris shows your brain is basically a very persuasive narrator. So is free will completely dead? Enter Daniel Dennett, a philosopher who walks in with a gentle smile and says, well, yes and no. Dennett doesn't deny the science. He agrees with Harris that our decisions are shaped by causes we don't fully control. He accepts that determinism, the idea that everything is caused by something else, has a pretty strong grip on the universe. But instead of throwing out free will entirely, he redefines it. He reframes it in a way that feels more humane, less robotic, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit comforting. This is what's called compatibilism, the idea that determinism and free will can, surprisingly, coexist. How does that work? Simple. If you don't demand too much from free will. For Dennett, we don't need ultimate cosmic-level freedom to have something meaningful. We just need the capacity to reflect, reason, weigh outcomes, and act in line with our values, even if those values were shaped by things we didn't choose. Sure, you didn't pick your genetics or upbringing, but you can respond to them. You can deliberate. You can consider consequences. That, to Dennett, is enough. You're not free in the magic soul floating above cause and effect sense. You're free in the I know hitting snooze again means I'll hate myself later sense. It's freedom with constraints, which is to say, freedom that actually fits in the real world. Dennett thinks the mistake is expecting too much of freedom. We want to be little gods, immune from influence, self-authored from scratch. But that's not how anything in nature works. A tree doesn't choose where it's planted, but it still grows. A bird doesn't design the wind, but it still flies. For Dennett, human freedom is like that. Messy, limited, but functional. Not perfect autonomy, but flexible responsibility. And that's where Dennett's real focus lies: responsibility. He argues that if we throw out free will entirely, we risk throwing out moral accountability too. If no one is truly responsible, then no one is guilty. But also, no one is heroic. No one deserves praise. No one can improve. Dennett wants to preserve our ability to grow, to change, to become wiser, even if we're doing it inside a web of causality. Still, critics of compatibilism like Harris find it intellectually dishonest. They say Dennett isn't really saving free will. He's just changing the label on the bottle and hoping no one reads the ingredients. If you're only free within a structure you didn't design, is that really freedom? Or just a more polite form of control? Dennett's reply: that's the only kind of freedom that actually matters. Not metaphysical freedom, practical freedom. Freedom as a system of checks and balances within your own brain. The kind that allows you to think twice, to reflect, to regret, to learn, and over time to become more of the kind of person you want to be. It's not glamorous, it's not romantic, but it's usable. And that's why Dennett's version resonates with people who live in the real world, where choices are messy, context is everything, and perfection is a fantasy. So here we are, between Schopenhauer's determinism, Harris's neuroscience, and Dennett's pragmatism. One says you're a slave to your will, one says your brain acts before you show up. The other says yes, but you can still do something about it, because your ability to reflect is the only freedom you're ever going to get. And maybe that's not a full escape from the cage, but it's a window, one you can lean against, look out of, and say, all right, I didn't choose everything, but I can still choose something, even if it's just how I respond. Are you responsible if you never really chose? Let's say everything Schopenhauer, Harris, and even Dennett said is true. You didn't choose your genes. You didn't choose your childhood. You didn't choose your parents, your first language, or your first trauma. You didn't choose your core fears, your IQ, your serotonin levels, or the way your brain responds to stress. And if that's the case, what exactly are you responsible for? That's the question that makes people nervous. Because if we admit we're shaped by causes beyond our control, then where does accountability go? Do we just let everyone off the hook? Do we tell the murderer, the thief, the corrupt executive, don't worry, it wasn't really you? And if no one is responsible for their bad behavior, can anyone take credit for the good? The tension here isn't just legal, it's existential. Most of us want justice, but we also want mercy. We want to believe in second chances, but we also want people to be punished when they deserve it. That whole system of reward, blame, punishment, pride is built on the idea that people could have done otherwise, and now you're being told, maybe they couldn't. So where does that leave us? Some go full nihilist. If no one has free will, then nothing matters. But that misses something. Responsibility doesn't vanish just because freedom is limited. It changes form. It stops being about ultimate blame and starts being about causality and compassion. Instead of asking, who should we punish? You ask, what produced this outcome and how do we stop it from happening again? Take addiction. The old model says bad choice, weak will, moral failure. The emerging model backed by science says early trauma, brain chemistry, environmental stress, lack of support. Same behavior, different story. And when the story changes, so does the response. Not softer, just smarter, more humane. Less about retribution, more about healing, context, and yes, prevention. This doesn't mean everyone's off the hook. Actions still have consequences. Society still needs structure. But it does mean we start replacing blame with curiosity. Instead of asking what's wrong with this person, we ask what happened to them. That's not an excuse. That's insight. That's how systems improve instead of just punish. And what about pride? What about your own success? If you didn't really choose your discipline, your drive, your good habits, do you get to feel proud of your achievements? That depends on how you define pride. If pride means I built this all by myself, then maybe not. But if pride means I did the best I could with what I was given, then absolutely. You may not have chosen your starting point, but you still walked the path. You still showed up, tried, failed, learned, kept going. That effort matters, even if it wasn't born in total freedom. In fact, when you let go of the myth of radical self-authorship, something beautiful happens. You stop comparing yourself so harshly to others. You stop blaming people for not being where you are. You start seeing how much of life is determined by luck, by context, by invisible layers of influence. And that makes you more empathetic, not just toward others, but toward yourself. You stop expecting perfection. You stop hating yourself for the things you struggle to change. You start working with your humanity instead of trying to transcend it. Responsibility then becomes something softer. Less about guilt, more about growth, less about punishment, more about process. You're still responsible for learning, for listening, for evolving, but now you carry that responsibility like a gardener tends a plant, not like a judge pounding a gavel. Because here's the deeper truth. Even if you didn't choose your past, you're still living in its echo. And maybe you can't change the sound, but you can learn how to listen to it better, how to soften the reverb, how to sing your own note over it. And that's where real responsibility begins. Not in control, but in care. What happens to meaning when free will dies? So if free will is dead, or at least wounded, what does that do to meaning? That's the question that lingers like smoke after the fire. Because meaning, for most people, is built on the foundation of choice. You chose your values, you chose your path, you chose love, growth, forgiveness. If those choices were illusions, beautifully dressed impulses shaped by biology and chance, doesn't that unravel everything? It might seem that way at first. If we're just elaborate chemical reactions with childhood baggage, what's the point of trying? Why seek truth, justice, beauty, if we're just passengers on a train going where the tracks already lead? But that view only feels hopeless if you think meaning requires ultimate control. What if it doesn't? What if meaning survives, even thrives, without free will? Think about music. You don't choose the notes in a song. You don't control the laws of harmony or rhythm. And yet, within those constraints, there's infinite expression. The structure is fixed, but the emotion is real. Life might be similar. Maybe we're not conductors with a blank slate. Maybe we're instruments, tuned by nature and nurture, but still capable of playing something honest, something moving. Maybe meaning doesn't come from authoring your destiny, but from fully inhabiting it. And here's the thing. We already live like this. We find meaning in art, even when it's fiction. We cry at movies, root for characters, feel betrayed by plot twists, even though we know it was all written. So why is it so hard to imagine that your own life, while shaped by unseen hands, could still be deeply meaningful? The truth is, the death of free will doesn't erase your story. It just asks you to read it differently. Not as a heroic tale of pure independence, but as a tangled narrative full of unexpected turns, strange inheritances, and moments of grace. You didn't write all the chapters, but you're still in them. You still feel. You still grow. And that growth is real, even if the soil wasn't chosen. Some might argue that we need the illusion of free will to give life purpose. But illusions are fragile. They shatter. They deceive. Real meaning, the kind that endures, comes from facing the truth and caring anyway. You didn't choose your suffering, but you can still respond to it with dignity. You didn't choose your gifts, but you can still use them well. You didn't choose the world, but you can still shape a corner of it with love. And isn't that what meaning really is? Not an abstract philosophical prize, but the way we choose, yes, choose, in whatever capacity we can, to engage with the reality we're given. Not because it's perfect, not because we're totally free, but because we're here, conscious, capable of reflection, capable of kindness, capable of creating beauty, even in a system that never asked for our opinion. So what happens to meaning when free will dies? Nothing. Or everything. It depends on how you define it. If meaning was about control, then yes, it crumbles. But if meaning is about connection, attention, and presence, then it remains, perhaps even deepens. Because now it's not based on illusion, It's based on something more honest, more tender, the mystery of being alive in a world you didn't choose and still finding reasons to care. Maybe we're not as free as we think. Maybe the choices we obsess over are just ripples in a river we never chose to fall into. But here's the twist. Maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe it's a relief. Because if we didn't choose our past, our traumas, our thoughts, then maybe we can stop blaming ourselves for everything. Maybe freedom isn't about control, but awareness. Maybe it's not about being the author, but about learning to read the story with open eyes. When you see the gears turning, you're no longer just part of the machine, you're watching it. And in that act of watching, a new kind of freedom is born, not to change the script, but to understand it deeply. And that, paradoxically, might be the most human thing of all. If this video made you question your choices, well, maybe you didn't have a choice. But you do have one now. Subscribe for more provocations that challenge your mind and unsettle your assumptions. Drop a comment. Do you believe in free will, or are we just fancy meat robots playing out scripts we didn't write? Share this with a friend who thinks they're the CEO of their destiny. Let's start a conversation, not to agree, but to think deeper. Because even if free will's a myth, curiosity doesn't have to be.